Fleming in the Philippines here, and it's a very rainy afternoon. This is the rainy season, and the noise that you can hear is the rain outside. So we'll just carry on, never mind. Now today I want to talk about gender non-conforming children and the possibility that they might end up transitioning, that is, being transsexual. So let's just recap a little bit so that we know what we're talking about. What is a gender non-conforming child? A gender non-conforming child is a child who persistently expresses a desire to be of the opposite sex, who likes to play as the opposite sex, likes to play with toys normally associated with the opposite sex, perhaps likes to wear the clothing of the opposite sex. If a boy might well wear a towel or a t-shirt on his head to simulate long hair. Janet Mock's book Redefining Realist gives an incredibly insightful and moving account of what it's like to be in that position from the point of view of the child. They might like to try makeup, they might want to go to school using a girl name, they might insist that you call them a girl name around the house, that sort of thing. These are gender non-conforming boy children, and gender non-conforming girls will be doing something similar but the other way around. Around about the age of 3 to 4, although you might not be aware of this, they're going to start having crushes, romantic crushes rather than sexual ones, on members of the same sex. They'll form strong attachments to members of the same sex. Typically, family, friends, family relatives within the older relatives within the family. They'll also form very strong feelings for example, film stars, TV characters of the opposites of the same sex, right? So they'll start having, crushes on Tom Cruise or whoever, if they're boys. So this is very gender norm conforming activity. Now, lots and lots and lots of children experiment with gender roles when they're young, and it's quite normal, and it doesn't mean anything. I'll quote you a case of a particular boy child known well to me who, at the age of 2, had spent 6 months living Peter Pan, and then decided, for whatever reason, that he wanted to explore Wendy's character. And so for a few weeks he was Wendy, and then it went away, and it was fine. That isn't really gender non-conforming behaviour, that's just role play. That's just exploring roles. And people's sexuality, which is what completely informs your character, Freud kind of had this right, is being formed. It's innate, but it's crystallising in this period of between 2 to 6 years old, around about here, and they're starting to find out what they actually are in terms of their sexuality and therefore of their gender. And quite often a child will do this, they'll experiment, they'll try out a particular mode of dress or something like that, and they go, it's not for me. And they move on, don't worry about it, especially with creative children, that's likely to happen. And it's not something you should get concerned about, and it's not something you make a fuss about. When we talk about persistent and insistent, we're talking about persistency. Well, I would say that you need to be looking at something that lasts at least 6 months to a year, of consistent desire to express themselves in a way that would be more consistent with the opposite sex. So that's persistent and consistent. It's the same. Every day they're the same. Every day they're wearing the towel on their heads. Every day they're trying on mummy's shoes. They want to wear the makeup. Then they go to school, they don't like the boy names and stuff like that. And obviously the opposite for girls. The insistency is a very important thing. Insistency is generally taken to be a factor in whether they'll end up being transsexual or just not transsexual. We'll leave that at that just now. If the more insistent they are, the more likely. If they really don't like going to school as a boy, if they're boys, or as a girl if they're girls, if they want to be called by a girl name if they're a boy at school, in public with others, if they don't like wearing the appropriate uniform for their sex and cause a lot of fuss about it and are really distressed, you've got persistent, consistent and insistent, and you've got something going on here that you're going to have to pay attention to. What you should do in the early years is absolutely nothing. try to accommodate this without massive disruption. If you have other children, they're going to ask questions about it. You're going to have to be honest with them and just try and explain that this other child is finding out about themselves. Don't worry about them, they'll be fine. Da-da-dee-da, do that. Still your brother, still your sister. You love them just as much, no matter how they present themselves, and try to reach an accommodation with their school and clubs that they go to, so that there's no friction and that there's no coercion, because coercion is very dangerous. You risk cementing behaviours in that perhaps wouldn't otherwise be cemented in just by forcing the issue. Now, there have been a number of studies, and Dr. James Cantor recently, a couple of years ago now, posted an article on Psychology Today suggesting that nearly all gender non-conforming children would not appear homosexual, transsexual at the end of it. And yeah, Jim, that wasn't exactly honest of you. I wrote a letter which I'll put on my site to Dr. Cantor, pointing out that most of the studies that he referred to, and he did refer to a number of them, were more than 30 years old. And since cultural and social climate is a big factor in this, they can't really be taken seriously, or they can't have weight today, because the society and culture has changed. Of the four more up-to-date ones, a Dutch study went way beyond the evidence, because 40% of their subjects after a certain age had simply failed to continue to attend the clinic, and they had assumed that they were, obviously they had reverted to a standard presentation, and there's no evidence for that. That's way beyond the evidence. It's just as likely that they decided that they were HSTS and decided that they were going to avoid contact with all the places they had previously known as boys if they were girls. Right? So that study basically is null. You can't take it seriously. I'll put the names on my site for you. Other studies, well, one of them only dealt with girls, and now girls, yes, you get homosexual transsexualism in girls. You do get trans men. You get non-homosexual trans men as well. It does appear that their numbers are fewer, and they're not anything like as well studied as the male form. What we do know is that HSTS in girls always telegraphs as well. It always has this very, very long history of childhood GNC. If, by the way, a child expresses, particularly a girl child, expresses body dysmorphia, that's hatred for parts of her body, like, I don't like my boobs, mum, what's happening to me, and that sort of thing, prior to showing signs of gender non-conformity and gender dysphoria, that's almost certainly not actually gender dysphoria, but we'll discuss that in another piece. Going back to the studies, the problem with all of them was that they didn't take into account the social situation that was applied to the child. And you have to understand that children, adolescents, really want to please the adults around them. They want to please their peer group. And if adults are really being negative about something they're doing, then there is a good chance they won't do it. And so when you look at studies that say, 90% of children don't turn out HSTS, that's 90%. That 90%, you don't know how much pressure they were put under to not transition. They may have been under relentless parental, peer, and professional pressure. Now, I say that with justification, because there's a man called Dr. Ken Zucker. Ken Zucker was defenestrated in a way that I really, really am angry about, and it should never have happened. But he was still very, very wrong, who believed that it was better that gender non-conforming children would be so-called gay boys or gay girls than to transition. And he went to any length to try to make that happen, including famously quoting, "Take away the Barbies," by which he meant take away all the things that your boy child likes to play with and likes to identify with, so that you can condition him into being gender conforming. Now, that's child abuse. Now, if your gender non-conforming child, playing with his Barbies if he's a boy, gets to be puberty, it is probable that a good deal of this will settle out at puberty, and they will start to establish sexual desires which will be within perhaps the more normative range. So gay boys might start having crushes on other gay boys, for example. That doesn't happen with all of them, and it is again subject to peer pressure and conditioning. What you have to understand, however, is that all persistent, consistent and insistent gender-conforming children who get to puberty and go through it, continuing with their gender non-conformity, persistent, consistent and insistent, are what we call transgender homosexual. Right? They're gay. There's no way around that one. They're not going to be heterosexual kids. You can disabuse yourself, if you're a parent, of that idea. Your child is going to be either a gender-conforming homosexual or a homosexual transsexual. And what makes the difference between these two is a matter of degree. They're not intrinsically different. They're not different of order. They're simply both on a scale of development. So that gender-conforming homosexuals are at one end, and at the far end you get homosexual transsexuals. Now, you then must understand it logically follows that homosexual transsexualism is the logical endpoint of the scale of development upon which all transgender homosexuals sit, right? It's the logical endpoint. Whether or not they will appear to be homosexual transsexuals rather than GCH is entirely or largely dependent on the social climate that they live in. Anglo-Saxon and particularly US American culture is extremely conformist and hostile to difference. That's why it's dissolving into the ridiculous identity politics, identitarian groups that it currently is, because everybody within a particular group must conform to a very strict set of rules, otherwise they'll be ostracized. And this is a well-known and frequently observed feature in US American society, you see. So what is happening is that society uses the tools it has, which will be things like beatings, ostracism, refusal of employment, the whole gamut, to get individuals to conform to the way that they think is right. I live in a place where this doesn't apply. I live in the Philippines. Now, there are many things about the Philippines which are very collectivist in nature, but it is actually a very open and tolerant society. There is no sanction against anal sex. There's no sanction against homosexuality. There's really no sanction against transsexualism. Trans women might occasionally get a little bit of grief from some of the most religious people in the society, and sometimes they'll get, low-level barracking, but they're not going to get beaten up or killed because they're transsexual. They're going to live normal lives with most people being really nice to them and just no problem. So it's a completely open society within which people can be whatever they want to be in terms of their gender. It's just not going to be a problem. Society will not intervene to try to change you. There are cases where perhaps if you want a particular kind of job, if you want to be a lawyer, you probably have to cut your hair, So there is some residual discrimination going on, but it's nothing like the level and intensity that you see in places like the United States. So we can look at a place like this and ask ourselves, what's the difference, And it amazes me. It amazes me that the premier sexologists who claim to know all about these things never come to Asia or South America. They don't look in the places where there's transsexualism, transgender, everywhere. I walk out the door and we bump into them, in the local sari shops. You bump into transsexuals. You go uptown, they're all over the place, And okay, this is Angeles City. It's a hot spot. That's why I'm here. But you go across the Philippines or across South Asia, you'll find people who are transsexual, transvestite. They're everywhere. Nobody cares. So it's a neutral environment. And what we see here is that there are very, very much fewer gender-conforming homosexuals, that's gay boys, and very many more HSTS. So the same population, basically, I would think statistically it comes to around about the same, but the transsexual element is massively larger because there's so little social disapproval, so little social antagonism against being transsexual in this climate. In this climate, if you're gay, you're a girl. That's it. And if your boss might well say, you're going to have to pretend you look like a boy because you're on the front desk at the hotel welcoming the guests, but you're still a girl. As far as the society is concerned, you're a girl, and that's it. You're not a man. Okay, so in the West, it's very different. Here, in the West, there's a real antagonism towards male femininity and female masculinity, and this pervades the entire society. I mean, we have kids in England now, because it's hot there, going to school in skirts, and everybody's like, oh, what's going on? Why the hell shouldn't they? I mean, I'm Scottish, I wear a kilt, so what? Why does it matter? Why does it matter what somebody looks like? It's their choice, So a lot of what's going on here is really, it's very questionable. And what we seem to have is people who are what we might call gender critical are getting involved in this argument not because they have the interests of the children or even their parents at heart, but they have other political interests. One of these is that there is a school of feminism which believes that gender is something which is a negative thing that it should be got rid of. They believe that it's something that was invented by men to suppress women. Well, that's complete bullshit. It's just nonsense. Gender is how you express your sexuality. It's that simple. It's how you let other people know what kind of partners you're interested in. That's all it is. This idea that it was invented by men to keep women down, it's just horseshit. But these people are so inculcated with they're so indoctrinated with these ideas, which basically come from Karl Marx, that they can't let go of them. So they're busy trying to get rid of gender. So when they see people adopting what they call gender stereotypes for the opposite sex, they're horrified and they say, no, you mustn't do that, because what you're doing is you're continuing something that we want to see destroyed. But the trouble is that the feminists are a tiny minority of people, and they don't speak for most of us. That not only are they wrong theoretically, they're wrong in real terms. They don't understand what gender is, and it just doesn't relate to them, and so they don't understand transsexualism. They just don't. They don't get it at all. A central concept in the gender critical movement is that it's better to be gay than to be transsexual. And this basically is the same as Ken Zucker's notion. Get rid of the Barbies, I'd rather you were a gay boy than a trans woman. The trouble is there's no evidence for that. Why is it better to be gay than a trans woman? Can somebody bring me actual evidence that people are happier as gays than trans women? And I can tell you, going around the Philippines, no, that's not what I see. What I see is a lot of very well-adjusted, happy trans women living their lives, having fun, being young girls about town. No big deal. When I go to the West, when I go to Europe, when I encounter gay men, I see a lot of very self-conscious, not very well-adjusted people who are trying very hard to hide their gender dysphoria, which is what they have. You have to understand that all transgender homosexuals, which is what a gender non-conforming child who consists and doesn't desist will be, they all have gender dysphoria. And it's just a question of how well they're able to hide it, how well they're able to manage it. Some of them will go, I'm not having any of that. I'm going to transition, and that's that. Some will, out of various reasons, perhaps for respect for their parents or simply out of fear, which is quite common, they'll hide. They'll be okay. Well, I'll just pretend to be a boy, but they hate it and they hate themselves for it. You should read what Juno Dawson has been writing recently. Juno Dawson, a former gay male who said, I've had enough of that, and certainly not the first one of those I've met, exposing the fact that the gay community is full. It's full up to the ears of gender dysphoria. So how is that a better solution? How is that a better outcome, that somebody joins a community like that? The gay male community in the West is notorious for promiscuity, sexually transmitted diseases, emotional abuse. I mean, you name it. It just goes on and on and on. Is that what you want for your son? Because what an HSTS wants is to find a nice man to marry. And maybe adopt a few kids with. That's what she wants. She wants a perfectly normal life, in other words. She doesn't want to be a part of the vanguard of some massive social change. That's, by the way, why most HSTS are somewhat conservative. Another reason that is given for why it might be better to be a gay man or a gay woman than transsexual is hormones and surgery. Well, listen, if you're human, you have a life on hormones. It's that simple. If you didn't have hormones, you'd be dead. So everybody has a life on hormones. And cross-sex hormones simply replicate the levels of hormones found in the opposite sex. It's that simple. So if there are if there are morbidities which are more prevalent in one particular sex, they will be prevalent in people who take HRT to emulate that sex. That's as simple as it is. So trans men are more prone to heart disease, and trans women are more prone to, for example, estrogen cancers. It's that simple, really. Don't get upset about it. It's the way it is. As far as the surgeries are concerned, well, I think that in the case of trans men, of women, young girls transitioning, well, there's a big issue here because it's a lot of surgery. And I think that in itself is probably worth a different video, but we're mainly talking about boys here, and for male to feminine, the operation is simple, quick, extremely well researched and understood now. It's sophisticated, and the results are normally absolutely fine. It's not a lifetime of surgery at all, as some have claimed. It is usually one visit to the surgeon with a couple of follow-up checkups. Some surgeons like to do the initial surgery in 2 stages, where they create they invaginate first. They actually do the work to the penis and create the vagina first, and let that heal up internally, and then finish the details of the labia later, because there's less edema and it's just easier to get a nice job. It's more predictable. Others do it in one go because they think, well, it's 2 operations rather than one, so maybe we just try and do it in one. Both methods work extremely well, and after the operation, the patient will be required to use a thing called a stent. They come in a range of sizes. They're basically dildos, and they're used to dilate the neovagina for usually around about a year until its form is fixed. It's all healed up. Tissues all around it are all healed up. Everything is as it should be. It's not going to collapse, prolapse, or anything else like that. And after that, that's it. She lives the rest of her life as a woman. How is that? How is that better? How is that worse than living a life of constant nagging gender dysphoria, being depressed? How is it worse than living in a culture where, as I say, promiscuity and sexually transmitted diseases are everywhere? We have to understand that conditioning people to follow the demands of a non-conformist society is not the role of a professional. The role of a professional is to find out how the person they're dealing with would be most happy. And if that is as a woman, talking about boys here, then they should transition. The fact is, if you have the persistency, the insistency, and the consistency, then this child is transgender or homosexual. There's no way around that one. All you're deciding is whether he or she should conform. We're talking about boys here, so he should conform to society's ideas of what he should be, or whether he should be allowed to follow his own path. And I'm for letting them follow their own path. That's essential. This gender critical political movement is entirely negative. It is, excuse me, that's my dog. It's just a way that a tired, burned out, and scientifically inaccurate political movement is trying to hold on to its position of authority. And we need to say no. Do it on your own time. Don't do it on the lives of vulnerable kids. Stay out of it. And I would say the same to autogynephilic trans activists. who are also putting their dirty little fingers in this particular pot. But the gender crits and the trans activists, I would say, just get the hell out of it. Leave it to the people involved to find their own path. Leave them completely alone as children. Neutral support as adolescents, possibly with the addition of puberty blockers, T blockers in boys for a period of time. They are going to be homosexual. You can't change that. You won't be able to change it. You can't turn them straight. If that's what your idea is, that you can end up with a straight child, you know, happily married with kids, forget it. Just forget it. It ain't going to happen. The only question is, how much misery are you going to cause trying to get there? And you have to ask yourself as a parent, and I'm a parent, I've got 4 kids, would you rather have a boy who becomes your daughter, or a boy who disappears from your life and you never see him again? Never. Because that is what happens. When parents try too hard to prevent their children from going the way they want, the children simply walk away. The stories of suicide are vastly exaggerated, but the idea of woodworking, removing yourself from the environment in which you grew up and never ever making contact with it again, that happens all the time. And if you as a parent don't want that to happen, you have to get behind your child. You have to get behind him. You have to welcome the fact that your son is now your daughter.